We are going to be talking a lot. You can't talk about water quality, the price of water without, or price of clean water, without talking about nitrates and nitrogen. And before we get into the kind of nitty gritty of that, I want to take a minute to talk, just do a kind of glossary of terms. What is nitrate? What is nitrogen? Why should we care if it's in our water or not? So just in terms of the setting the stage about why people might hear that come up quite a bit, I wonder if I could start with David. Could you address that question a little bit in terms of what is nitrate? And I'll bring other people in this as well, but why should we be concerned about whether there's nitrates in our water or not?
Sure. Well, thanks for having me. So nitrate is it's a form of nitrogen, and it's a dominant form of nitrogen that ends up in our water supply that is derived from things. There's naturally occurring sources, but for us, our big challenge in Iowa is nitrate as a byproduct of the agricultural operations in the state. So fertilizer, manure is rich in nitrogen. Nitrate is the form that, as it works its way into the stream network, that becomes our drinking water supply or into the groundwater, it becomes nitrate, and we worry about it because it's a regulated drinking water contaminant. And so there is a standard set by the EPA of 10 milligrams per liter, that if we have nitrate above that level in a water supply, a regulated water supply, then there is an adverse health risk. And we regulate nitrate currently because of an acute threat and its ability to interfere with how oxygen is transported through the blood. And so you've probably heard of it as blue baby syndrome, that infants are particularly vulnerable to elevated levels of elevated levels of nitrate because of the potential for it to interfere with how oxygen can distribute in the body and actually deprive them of oxygen to the point where they look a little blue. There is emerging evidence that there are health risks beyond blue baby syndrome that can potentially occur at lower levels of nitrate. Those aren't necessarily reflected in the current regulations. This is one of those instances with nitrate where the body of science has sort of outpaced how we set regulations, where there is the potential for longer term health effects through long-term exposure to nitrate. At least that's what the science is beginning to show. But for now, the regulation is still set at that 10 milligrams per liter, even though some will advocate that it should be much lower, maybe down around 1, because of the potential for long-term ingestion of nitrate and what that might mean for chronic illnesses like cancer, birth defects, other more long-duration exposure health impacts that could result.
Rebecca, do you want to add to that a little bit from your research? And as David pointed out, there's emerging science that is looking at nitrates and raising some other concerns as well. And I know you've looked into this a little bit yourself also.
Yeah, so, and thank you so much, Craig, and everyone else on the panel. It's really great to be here. And I will first admit I am not a native Iowan, although I have family in Nebraska, so it's pretty close. And I've driven to Council Bluffs and through Iowa many times. So thank you for letting me interlope a little bit on this session. Yeah, in our report, which we released in January, just ahead of the state legislature start, speaking to what David said about the other health risks besides baby blue syndrome, there was actually a study just in the last few years that found in Iowa, there's about 300 cases of cancer as a result of nitrates in drinking water. So that's just an estimate based on one study. This is sort of an emerging field of research. And we reported in our report earlier in January that if you treated all of those cancer cases in Iowa, the average cost is about $200,000 per person. The state is spending about $64 million just to treat these cancer cases that have been estimated by this study. The health risks are clearly very high and they're very costly as well. And again, this area of research on cancer and the other health effects that Dave was alluding to is new, but I think it's definitely something that we have to look out for and keep in mind when addressing this issue.
And of course, there are many factors that influence the price of water, this being one of the major ones. On that topic, let me quickly say that I should remind our audience members, if you were here with us earlier in the week for other sessions, you'll already know this. If you have questions as we go along, please submit them, and those will win the way to me, and we can work them into our discussion and make sure they get asked. So feel free to send questions along as we, you don't have to wait till the end, you can send them as they come up. But in terms of water quality, the price of water, it's interesting that there's so much we take for granted as consumers. Just for my cup of coffee here this morning, or I guess now afternoon, I turned on the water faucet. Water came out as I expected. It was always going to be there. I just assumed it was going to be of high quality. And I didn't really think too much about this, but in the background, I just assumed that it's going to be low price. And so when you think of on demand, high quality, and low price, those three things don't go in the same sentence very often. Others will be able to speak more directly to this, but Rebecca, you did a study, your group did a study that kind of, I thought, framed the issue about that very pressure, about the cost pressures going up as over the next 5 years. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that study, just to kind of frame the issue, and then we can bring other people in to talk about what their experience has been.
Yeah, of course. So that same report that we released this last January, we wanted to put a price tag on the cost of treating nitrates in drinking water in Iowa. So we actually followed in the footsteps of some Iowa State researchers who had a few years ago estimated the cost of nitrates in drinking water. But we wanted to project out and look to the next 5 years to see, what is it going to cost the state to continue to treat drinking water, in different public water systems. So what we found was, there are 58 public drinking water systems that currently treat drinking water for nitrates. And if we assume sort of the same level of treatment and maintenance and operation among those systems, assume there are no new systems that come online to treat nitrates, that Iowa will spend between 41 million and 330 million over the next 5 years just to treat the nitrates, to remove the nitrates from drinking water. And that is a pretty big price tag, especially, when you're talking, Craig, about low cost, reliability. And the one thing that we found that was also, I think really important to consider in this discussion is that rural communities face the highest cost on a per capita basis. I know there's a lot of discussion statewide about Des Moines Waterworks and how, it obviously provides a lot of drinking water for state residents. I'm sure Amy can talk even more about the cost that they're incurring. But the rural residents in Iowa really face a disproportionate, burden of these costs. And that obviously has policy implications for those county and municipal governments. And we have to consider who's paying the bill there for that treatment cost.
Thank you. It is, when you talk about water quality nitrates, there is often I guess what I would call an urban-rural divide. But as your research showed, it's really an issue for all Iowans and not just Iowans who live in metro areas. But Amy, let me turn to you and pick up on that conversation a little bit in terms of what you're facing in terms of, at the Des Moines Waterworks, what you're facing in terms of making sure the water meets the standards, not only for nitrate, but the other contaminants as well. And I know you don't run, I don't think anyway, run the nitrate facility every day, but it's very expensive when you do. I just wonder if you could kind of tell us and set the landscape a little bit about, when I turn on the faucet, I don't give it a second thought. But someone like you probably loses sleep over this issue.
Mhm.
And so I wonder if you could just kind of pick it up from there and talk about the landscape you're facing at the waterworks in trying to meet the standards and
Right.
keep the price where it's not exorbitant.
It's a balance for sure. And we do lose sleep some days. I'll start by kind of setting the stage and giving some context. Des Moines Waterworks, two of our primary sources of water are the Raccoon River and the Des Moines River. And surface water, which rivers are, make water treatment challenging because the water quality is volatile and changes depending on what's happening on the land around those rivers and in the watershed. The Raccoon River, incidentally, was just named earlier this year one of the nation's most endangered rivers by an organization, American Rivers. So it is a challenge. Nitrate is historically been a challenge. It wasn't a problem over 30 years ago. And then in 1992, Des Moines Waterworks exceeded the nitrate standard. And as a result of that, we built a world-class nitrate removal facility. It cost $4 million in 1992 to build that facility. And, even if we don't run it, you're right, Craig, we don't have to run it every day. And there are, frankly, even some years that we get by without running it. But even when we don't run it, it's $1 million just in capital costs. It's a fixed asset. There's fixed costs related to it. In 2015, we had to run that facility 177 days out of that year, 50% of the year. The cost to run that is about $10,000 a day. So, those nickels and dimes, they begin to add up. Since 2000, so I don't have records since the beginning of time, but since 2000, we have spent almost $18 million on that facility alone, just on nitrate. And nitrate isn't the only challenge that we face. So this is a big issue for us. And it in some ways is an equity issue because, as Rebecca said, the downstream water customers, Des Moines Waterworks customers, are picking up the tab for upstream polluters. And, there's an equity issue that we are concerned with. Another challenge that we face most recently is cyanobacteria. And that's a whole nother challenge that is really causing us this year to even avoid one of our primary river sources, the Des Moines River, which frankly is a bit of a kick in the gut during a drought when you need as much water as you can get from your sources. So really nitrate and cyanobacteria are our biggest challenges that we're facing.
Maybe talk a little bit about that, because I think that's new, at least fairly new. And I just tell me kind of what that is and why is it of a concern, the bacteria?
Yes. Cyanobacteria is really formed from a lot of phosphorus, and especially when the water is warm and stagnant, like it is during low flows, like it is this year. We've all seen these blue-green algae blooms that form on stagnant water. They can become toxic and release poisons into the water. They aren't always toxic. And it's difficult, frankly, to tell when they're going to be or to predict when they're going to be toxic. So we test for those now. 2016 was the first year that we detected levels of these toxins, microcystins in our water. And so we began early notification, which is required through drinking water standards. And so in 2016, we began testing for those. Now we test for them daily. And we try to avoid that water source because it's very difficult for us to treat these microcystins. Really, we're a lime softening plant. We're not reverse osmosis at our largest plant. And so we just really don't have a great way to treat these. And so we just avoid the source altogether. The last 2 years, we've had to avoid the river 110 days each of those years in 2019 and 2020. And as I mentioned, now we're avoiding the Des Moines River now.
We our newspaper has written about this issue, but not so much in terms of the drinking water, but in terms of algae blooms and effects on lakes and especially recreation, where it's still pretty obvious. Also, I want to bring Mark in this discussion a little bit because we are certainly talking about money, but the state DNR plays a lot of roles in this. And if I understand this correctly, the DNR is is pretty much the state agency that is responsible for making sure that everybody follows the EPA standards. And there's something like 400 different 400 different water services boards across the state. Some are run by cities, some by trustees. And my guess is that kind of all comes up into the DNR. So I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about, from your vantage point, what you see happening. And then I also wanted to kind of talk a little bit about the other influences on the cost of water besides nitrates.
All right. Thanks, Greg, and thanks for having me. And I'll just give you kind of my perspective, our role at the DNR. And in fact, we have over 1,800 public water supplies in the state of Iowa. And yes, we have primacy from the EPA to implement the Safe Drinking Water Act here in Iowa. So, we have great operators, we have great utilities. They're diligent. We just put together our annual compliance report for 2020, and 97% of our 1,800 public water supplies met all health-based standards of the Safe Drinking Water Act. Now, yes, it is a challenge. The Safe Drinking Water Act, just meeting that is no small task for utilities to meet. But on top of that, we're talking about microsystems. There is not a set regulatory level for microsystems. It's called a health advisory. So there's lots of health advisories that now are on the radar for states, EPA, and now utilities are looking at microsystems. Manganese is another one. Manganese is naturally occurring in our aquifers, but we're doing surveillance on our public water supplies to look at the manganese levels, because that can have health effects on vulnerable populations. And then we get into PFAS too. PFAS has a health advisory, and that's an emerging contaminant that we need to be aware of, and we're working on a surveillance project for Iowa to look at PFAS. Craig, you hit it on the head. I was thinking about the same thing when I was driving to work this morning on the price of water, the value of water, and what I did. I woke up, I took a shower, I went to the bathroom, I brushed my teeth, I ate breakfast, and then I got to work and I made coffee. So we cannot live without water. And just looking at the price, I did a little homework this morning. So the DNR, in conjunction with the Iowa Finance Authority, run the state revolving fund. That is a federal grant that states get to administer low interest loans for public water supplies in Iowa. Since the beginning, since 1996, we have loaned out over $1 billion of money for drinking water projects across the state. We're projected that we can loan an average of $100 million per year over the next 10 years. So we have capacity, but this last year, we loaned out $88 million. And so when I look at kind of the trend of how many dollars of low interest loans and a little bit of loan forgiveness, that is steadily on the rise. You know, there's more infrastructure that needs to be replaced. There's more treatment that is going in. You know, we're fortunate that we have the capacity we don't turn away any loan applicants as long as they're eligible. But there is a trend upward in the cost that goes into maintaining utilities infrastructure to make sure that they're in compliance.
And we've seen also
Can
in
I
Iowa.
add something there, Craig? I mean,
no, go ahead, please.
I mean, there's a few points I want to make based on some of the discussion we've been having. And one is, you know, it's a little silly, but there's an old saying, it's attributed to Ben Franklin, you know, you value water when the well runs dry. And so it's great we're having this conversation now, because we've got two major stressors on our source waters here in Iowa, right? It's climate change, which we're seeing with the drought that's hitting a good portion of the state. And it's our pollution that's coming from, you know, we can talk about the sources, but we shouldn't ignore that our source waters are getting more and more contaminated. And so, you know, that, you know, I feel like it's business as usual so far here in Iowa. And that normally I grew up, I'm also not a native Iowan. I grew up in Southern California, where on your bill, you had a line item for essentially what was the price they charged you so they could go and find an alternative source. It was like, I think it was called like a water sustainability charge. You know, I feel like we're kind of not having the right conversations here in Iowa about the level of sort of threat that's on our source waters, for one, that's not just driving the need for fancy treatment like what the Des Moines Water Works can do, but it's also forcing a lot of municipalities to have to seek out alternative source waters that the costs are just as astronomical to drill new wells and to find alternative supplies. And so it's kind of, this is a timely conversation, because I think there's more we need to be doing in sort of looking ahead. And I think these problems are just going to get, like Mark was saying, you know, harder and harder to deal with unless things change in how we protect our source waters. And so, yeah, and I want to also make one other point. Mark mentioned all these standing public health advisories. I mean, we haven't really been able to get new regulations on the books because a new regulation requires a cost benefit analysis. That's in the Safe Drinking Water Act now, since it's been revised in '96. And so all these things we're talking about these added costs that go to consumers, that would go to every municipality that needed a new source or a new treatment, is now to the point where it's stopping us from putting regulations in place for things we know are harmful, like perfluorinated chemicals, like perchlorate, like microcystins. It's preventing us from lowering a nitrate standard. So it's really all intertwined here. And it's, you know, we're kind of at a real like epicenter for it here in Iowa, because we have such degraded water resources from all of the intensity of ag and everything else that's going on in the state. And that's something I think we have to really start to really tackle head on, or this problem is going to make it even more insurmountable than it already feels like it is.
I hear what you're saying, and I couldn't help but think that of the state Supreme Court ruling that came out last week, where environmentalists were asking the courts to get involved in the water quality issue, and a very sharply divided court majority said, "Hey, this is in the realm of the political realm, the elected realm, not our branch of government." And so it seems like that's where the argument is going to have to play out in terms of regulations and money, essentially, to help address the issue. It's even, David, you certainly talked about a lot of things there, but it seems like it's even more complicated when you start thinking about, you know, just climate change alone, because so many cities are trying to look at building their water infrastructure to be resilient, so it can withstand droughts and floods better than it does now, and that's expensive. And that may not have a fat line directly to the price of water today, but it will in the future. And some of those costs are probably being absorbed right now. And we also have different parts of the infrastructure that, I mean, I know when I pay I get a city utility bill. It includes water, sewer, recycling. And so it doesn't really single out how much I pay for water. I get the whole shebang. And so if the city is embarking on a whole new wastewater treatment thing, I don't know how much of that is in my bill and how much of that is, the cost of water. I just get the bill. I see the bill is going up. And a lot of our smaller communities, the bills are going up quite a bit. Down in Tipton or Tiffin, the small community right by I-80 and 380, fast growing small community. Their utility bills are going up quite a lot because they have a brand new wastewater facility they're selling bonds for. In Iowa City, a different aspect of this, the water rates are going up because Procter & Gamble was a big user of water there, and they're leaving the city. I think they accounted for like a sixth of the revenue stream. And so that price is falling to everybody else now because they have to, maintain the bonds, pay off the bonds. So my point essentially is there's all kinds of different things going into the price of water. And the most urgent one, the one we see the most, is contaminants and pollution, which plays a huge role, obviously. David, picking up on that a little bit, and maybe Mark, you want to talk about this as well. What, in terms of how you can deal with this, what kind of resources are available if I'm an individual, or say I'm a farmer? What resources do I have that I might be able to make a tiny individual dent in the problem the state is facing? Mark, I think if I'm not mistaken, correct me if I'm wrong here, but the water quality projects, like the conservation projects, like end of field or those kinds of cover crops, that's all through the state agriculture department, right, and not through DNR.
And through the NRCS, Craig. The way DNR would get involved, we've got a source water protection program that can provide assistance to a utility like Des Moines Waterworks if they would want to put together what's called a source water protection plan. So we have employees at the DNR that would put together a local team at a community or municipal to come up with a plan. But then what are the resources? There are funding through NRCS and things like that, and then come up with a plan to protect their wellheads, for example. The other thing I would add, so we've got 1,800 public water supplies, but then we have private wells, people who aren't connected to a municipal water supply. And that encapsulates the population of Iowa. You're either getting water from a city or a rural water system, or from your own private well. If you're a farmer, you live on a homestead and have a private well, there is a mechanism called grants to counties. You can work with your local county public health professional to have your well sampled. And there is funding if you want to rehab your well or to plug your well. So there are some funding mechanisms available for individual private well owners.
I want to talk about private wells and then bring David into this as well, because so many people in Iowa do get their water from a private well, and many don't check or test and may not know what the levels are of nitrates or arsenic or anything else. There are some resources. You mentioned the grants to the county. Do the counties also go out and do testing for individuals? Or does maybe the University of Iowa does that?
So Mark was talking about the Grants County's program, which is a really great program that is unique, fairly unique to Iowa, and something that I think the state should be reasonably proud of, even though it certainly could perform better. It, like Mark was saying, it through county public health offices, and it's a program that's administered by the Iowa Department of Public Health. There is money available for testing, but it's entirely voluntary, that the well users are going to have to seek out the sanitarians and request that their well be tested for nitrate, bacteria, and arsenic was recently added in 2016. A colleague of mine and I, Sylvia Secchi, did an analysis on grants to counties. The money's not being spent as efficiently as it could. There's a lot more that could be done in terms of trying to promote the program so that well owners could be aware. The money is being historically underspent, as much in some years as 50% of the money that's allocated to the well program isn't getting used. And so there really is the need to just market the program better. And then I would also put out a pitch. The word equity was mentioned earlier, and I think it's an important one, particularly, all across the spectrum of the conversation here, but particularly for well owners. They are very much on their own, and that's why the grants to counties is a fairly unique thing for Iowa, is at least there's on an annual basis, some assistance. But I wish we could find a way to help those homeowners that are relying on a well that they know might be contaminated because the source water is contaminated. It's not a well that needs to be rehabilitated because it's cracked or something. It's actually just contaminated source water. That we could help them with some money to get a treatment system, because they're on their own for finding the resources to get a point of use or point of entry home system. And so that's a massive expectation for someone that may not have the resources. And that's what we find with most point of use systems, is those that need it most can't afford it. So we need to be addressing that issue, just because there are a good number of Iowans. It's about 300,000 that rely on private wells, and those groundwater resources are just as vulnerable to either drying up or becoming contaminated as some of our surface water sources. And so we need to be mindful of that. And I think there's more we could do. I mean, I would love to see recovery, the ARP money be made available in some form like that, because it's there and communities are looking for how to spend it, and they should be helping people like well owners in addition to doing other water infrastructure upgrades.
I'll add that to my list of, I do want to kind of recap the end of this, some points going forward. That's certainly one of them. But that brings me back to Rebecca. In the study that you did, you made some recommendations for things that the legislature should take a look at. And of course, the Iowa legislature is out of session for this year, but coming back next January. I just wondered if you could run through some of those points, if you're able, and talk about kind of what you're recommending that the legislature take a look at.
Yeah, that's a great question. And just to go back to something you said earlier about the cost of drinking water, I think some may be thinking, some on this, the audience members may be thinking, well, my bill doesn't feel so high, even if their water is being treated for nitrates. And I wanted to make the point that if folks aren't, paying the bill, on their water bill, the state or municipal governments are picking it up. And so it's taxpayer money. So I think, just to say that there's a lot at stake in addressing this issue at the source of the problem, not just for people's bills, but for, the state government and municipal government in Iowa. And so a lot of our recommendations are sort of in that context or bigger picture, that this is costing a lot of money. Let's spend state money wisely and treat the problem at its source. And so for us, we have been pushing for sort of enhanced policies at the state level to reduce the amount of nitrates that enter the water from agricultural lands, from livestock operations. So that's really key in addressing this issue at the source, at least for nitrates. And the other, the bacteria contamination that Amy and David mentioned earlier, and Mark. And I think there's a lot of ways to do that. And I think it's, up to Iowans, as a whole to really decide like how is this going to get solved with policy. There's lots of ways to do that. There's for farmers, you can imagine giving them support and technical assistance to adopt practices that reduce the amount of nitrates that come off the farm. With animal operations, there are some federal regulations from EPA that can be used to ensure that nitrates from those operations stay out of waterways. But there's additional things that the state can do in terms of its regulatory framework around those operations, especially the operations that have large amounts of animals. And so those are sort of the areas that we're really focused on in terms of state legislation. And I'm sure that other people on the panel probably have some ideas of their own about what is the most effective. And, for me, when I'm thinking just generally, and we work in other states, not just Iowa, feasibility politically is really important, but it has to be effective, right? The policy has to be effective. And so what kind of can accomplish both of those things at the same time is really crucial for this particular issue.
The kind of the premise of this is that it's cheaper to solve or to make progress on solving the pollution problem at the source than it is to take it out later, because it is costing so much more to remove it than it would actually cost to reduce it at the source. And that's kind of the upside down situation I think Iowa is in right now, which is obviously there are programs and a lot of farmers are doing these where they're planting cover crops, they're doing end of the row, and they're taking conservation and efforts, and some of them are very mindful and purposeful about it, but it is a voluntary program. And when you look to our northern neighbor in Minnesota, there is part of it that's required, but I don't think that is common throughout the Midwest. I think it's more of a voluntary program, and the question is whether that could be made more effective. Not requirement, but could it be made more effective? One of our sessions later in this week is going to be talking about Cedar Rapids, and this has more to do with flood management, I think, more than drinking water. But Cedar Rapids has been very active in getting a major player in watersheds north of the city in terms of improving the water quality and water management. And so trying to bring some of those conservation practices to bear and more of a, not so much of a scattershot approach, but more of a something where it could actually make a difference in one watershed rather than scattered throughout the entire state. I have a question from the audience here. David, this is for you, and it's a good question. How much do you think it would cost? You may have sent this yourself. How much do you think it would cost if every private well in Iowa were tested? I don't know if there's any way of knowing that, but do we even have the capacity to do that?
Yeah, so it's a good question. It's a hard one to answer simply because it depends on what you're testing for. We did an analysis like this, and the State Hygienics Lab is a certified laboratory that runs a lot of the testing in the state for the Grants to Counties program and beyond. They do a lot of the Safe Drinking Water Act's compliance testing for the public water systems as well. And I asked Mike Schuler, who leads the environmental group there, something like what it would cost to basically test every private well for every Safe Drinking Water Act regulated contaminant. So if you gave the private well users the same type of oversight that a public water system had, and I think we kind of kicked around something on the order of about $10,000. It's not cheap. It's to do it on a individual, because you would have to, there's a variety of pesticides, inorganics, there's bacteria. So it would be really sort of cost prohibitive to test for everything. A good example is perfluorinated compounds, the PFAS chemicals that Mark had mentioned earlier. The State Hygienics Lab has that test right now. There are private wells in Iowa that are vulnerable to PFAS contamination, but it's about $300 per sample to get tested. And so, you know, a homeowner is not going to really be all that eager to spend that amount of money. But you know, some will need to, because their water is contaminated through no fault of their own. And so this assistance that can be made available for testing, I will say the Grantston Counties has done a lot of good work to change how it's administered, that if there is a standing public health advisory issued by the EPA, that the IDPH will consider or essentially grant a waiver where the Grantston County's funds can be used for that testing. So we need to get out to well owners that might be vulnerable to PFAS or other manganese and let them know that these things can now get covered through the Grantston County's program, because it's not going to be possible to provide the same level of testing oversight.
And I assume that's an estimate of $10,000 per well.
Yeah.
Right.
And so, but the flip side of that is, and this is where the Grantston County's works, if you just did nitrate, bacteria, and arsenic, which are 3 pollutants that we felt were high priorities for Iowa and private wells, you know, it's much more reasonable. Those are much more standard and routine tests. And so that is something that's, you know, on the order of, I should know this, but probably about $100, you know, roughly to do those. And so something that's a little bit more reasonable, which is why the Grantston County's program can focus on those 3, is they're not terribly cost prohibitive.
Here's a question in terms of, let's say somebody gets, the well gets tested, and it's found that it is in need of remediation of some sort. What are the options? So if I'm a private well owner and my well lacks, it exceeds something that it shouldn't, what are the options that I have? Do I sink a new well and take the chances that might work? Or do I have to beg and plead for the nearest city to extend their water line out to me?
Mark, you want to take that?
Yep, I can take that. Okay, options that David already mentioned is a point of use or point of entry. So a treatment, let's say a reverse osmosis treatment system, like under the sink, or treating all the water going into the home. The problem with that is they can be expensive, and you need to maintain those. They can actually be worse if the owner does not maintain those. You can drill another well to a different source. Hopefully you're in the area of the state that you can drill to another source and have decent water quality. Craig, you mentioned the third option. If you're close enough to a rural water system, so northwest and kind of the southern half of the state have great rural water system networks. Northeast section of the state, there is not as much rural water system networking in there, because there's other groundwater sources available. If you're like a little subdivision that has not yet become a public water supply system, just based off numbers and definition, like you said, plead with the nearby public water supply. You know, I said, you know, we are the entity that makes sure that public water supplies are compliant. So if they are not, that would be one of the options, is to connect to a reliable and viable public water supply system here.
And I'll just add that in our report, you know, as I said, we looked at this Iowa State report that had been done in 2018 about this issue, and their estimate is that connecting to those existing systems is very expensive. So for a single household, it's between $50,000 and $185,000 a household, which, you know, there's an estimate that 25% of the groundwater wells in Iowa may be at risk of contamination with nitrates. So if you put all those systems into an existing water system, it'd be $9 billion. So that's a very, I mean, I'm sure that is consistent with what you know, Mark, that that's an expensive option, even though it is certainly one of them.
Yeah, we had something that actually it's ongoing right now here in our area with the city of Solon. There's a small development outside of Solon that has, I think, 14 homes in it, and they're on a private well, and the well tested too high for arsenic. And so the community went through this whole process of persuading the city council to approve extending the service out there, which I think is not still done at this point. So there's still a lot of people are drinking bottled water while they're waiting for this pipe to be completed. It may be done by now, but last time we checked, it was still underway. Let me pick up real quickly here on some questions I'm getting from the viewers here. And Mark, I don't know if you know the answer to this question. It's probably more for the Ag Department or USDA. But do you, from your vantage point, do you see whether are farmers eager to participate in these voluntary source water protection programs?
The only way I could speak to that is through the DNR source water protection program.
Mm-hmm.
I do know that some of them have been successful in working with their farmer neighbors, outside of city limits within the watershed of their public water supply wells in, negotiating land usage in those watersheds. Craig, I don't know the percentage of, the success rate in those negotiations, but I do know that it has been done.
I'll just add that, to get back to that issue, Craig, you asked about what individuals can do to,
right,
improve their own water. But I think the issue at play is there's many instances where the water quality is determined by someone that's far removed from the consumer, right? That's the problem in Des Moines. That water is entering their source zone already contaminated. And by all practical measure, our voluntary approaches for nutrient management, which are the root cause of nitrate and the cyanotoxins, the voluntary measures just aren't working the way they should, right? Chris Jones, my colleague here at the University of Iowa, he puts out great analysis. The nitrogen numbers are headed the wrong way in the state. It's very clear through work that's been done by Chris in partnership with state agencies like the DNR and the Geologic Survey that manure management is driving a lot of that stream nitrate, and particularly in livestock intense areas of the state. I'll say it again, if we aren't taking this drought and the current state of the Des Moines Waterworks is like sirens and alarm bells for us to get serious about what the future of our water resource management looks like in this state, we're doing it wrong. Like, we need to be having these conversations to make sure that, like, my kids in 30 years can stay in Iowa and not have to find towns that have been able to seek out available water. The need to keep shifting sources, to drill new wells, to install fancy end of pipe reactors, at a water treatment plant to remove pollution that's coming from people miles away, that can't last, right? That's not how we make thriving communities. So, we can talk all around it, but the idea of a voluntary approach to managing our nutrients, which are now a public health issue here for our drinking water consumers, it's going to have to change. And if it doesn't, then we're just going to, we won't all be as lucky as the waterworks to be able to afford and have the tax base to put in a treatment system or find new wells. There are communities that can't afford to use the obvious sources next to them because the water's too polluted, right? Like, that we can't really, that doesn't work, right? That's not how you build, a stable, thriving community.
One thing I would add to that, and I 100% agree with David, we can't continue to keep popping up facilities to deal with these issues. Resources are not endless. We really do need to start talking about the real correction. But we've been talking a lot about dollars and cents. But I think that there's a cost that we haven't really touched on, and that is the erosion of customer confidence. As water utilities really battle to keep their heads above water and meet these safe drinking water standards, customer confidence can be washed away. And the more we talk about degraded water quality, Many customers, that gets lost in translation of source water versus finished drinking water. And so what we find when we go out and talk to customers is, they'll say, I don't drink your water because you tell me it's bad. And so that's a real challenge for us from an education perspective to kind of bifurcate source water degradation from finished drinking water. We take something bad and we turn it into something good. But I think the real cost is loss of customer confidence, because if we lose that, it takes years to get that back.
The picking up on that a little bit, and back to my every time you turn on the faucet, you expect it to be there and you expect it to be high quality at a reasonable price. There are a lot of people who are spending a lot of money on bottled water, spending money on filtration systems and so on. Is that, do you think that's too much likely in the future, where people are going to lose confidence in their municipal water systems and turn to these other sources where they rightly or wrongly have more confidence?
It's certainly something we spend a lot of time educating our customers on. The value of tap water. Bottled water is so expensive. It is convenient. We understand it's embedded in our life. We can't, I'm sure all of us on the panel have drank bottled water. But it's certainly not something you need to sit at home and drink bottled water. And I think that we do need to continue educating customers on, the value that tap water plays. It is safe. And somehow we need to do a better job of talking about our dirty source water and our safe drinking water. And that's just a challenge that we face.
Well, and I'd also add, I'd be careful to be too general. I mean, there are some, the erosion of confidence in publicly supplied water is strong across the US, particularly in communities of color and low income communities. And usually for good reason, because they're ones that are usually historically have higher violations from their water providers.
Well, look at Flint, Michigan, right?
Well, and, but there's communities in Iowa. I've been in mobile home parks here in Iowa where you've got low income minority communities that are spending too much of their what they're earning on bottled water, because they don't trust the water that's being delivered to their system because of perpetual violations that have gone to that water system that's maybe the mobile home park. There's this issue, and there's other things too, right? I mean, when I get asked, I've had colleagues ask me, we're expecting, should my wife be drinking tap water? And I'll tell you, with the data that's out there on nitrate, I would encourage a pregnant woman to seek out an alternative source if they're relying on something that's delivering 5 to 10 milligrams per liter of nitrate. They seek out bottled water, they'll install a home RO, but those are costs they shouldn't have to bear. If we had a system that was working the way it should, we wouldn't have to have people take matters into their own hands and in their own income to seek out something that gives them greater peace of mind. We would be delivering that product 24/7 with that security. But there's the problems with the source water. There's the problems with the regulations not keeping up with the science because it's too much tied to cost benefit analysis, and politics comes into play. So there are these issues that we shouldn't ignore. And again, here, I think the real issue is the distributional effect. You've got pollution coming in from one actor and the burden being entirely felt by somebody else. I mean, that's like an inequity issue at the heart. Someone has to pay for pollution another person's causing. And that's passed to consumers. It's passed to, it's something that we should all want to try to figure out a way to solve, because it's affecting every island. It really is.
And I'll add that, just thinking about a family who's, got to purchase bottled water because their water isn't safe, that slice of your budget is coming from somewhere else, so that can have ripple effects on a family, whether it's, having enough food to put on the table, to paying your rent, to paying other bills. So, I agree with Dave that it's a kind of fairness question, at the end of the day, and the inequities are really important to think about.
Our hour is almost up. It's almost ironic that this year we launched these in-depth sessions because what we find during the Iowa Ideas Symposium in October is there's never enough time to talk about everything we want to talk about. So we started these in-depth sessions. We did one last month on higher education. We had 5 seminars on that. We're doing this one on water quality. And here an hour has gone by and there's so much more still to talk about. So I hope that people will continue the conversation. And I want to thank all the panelists for being here and taking time out of your day. Obviously, this is a huge issue on the future of Iowa and broader than Iowa, but especially in Iowa. I do want to mention that the conversation continues tomorrow and Friday at noon tomorrow. We have a discussion about called In Volumes, the impact of animal waste on water. And then on Friday at noon, we have a closer look at the Cedar River watershed and what's happening with Cedar Rapids being involved in the watersheds north of the city. So if you can tune into those, please do. They're free. You just have to register for them and they're free. And then I also want to make sure I mention that the virtual conference, the big conference, is October 14th and 15th of this year. Again, it's free to participate. You can register at iowaideas.com, and we'll have 9 different tracks of different topics and a mega panelist. We're doing it virtual again this year. We went to virtual last year in the pandemic and found out there were all kinds of advantages doing it that way. The panelists and the audience really like that. So we're doing it virtual again this year, October 14th and 15th. And our keynote speaker is Peggy Whitson. You may know her as the astronaut who, first woman to command the space station. She also holds the record as the American in space, the longest of any other American. And she's from Iowa. And right now she's among other things, is a rock star in the STEM world, encouraging young women to pursue careers in STEM education. She'll be really good to listen to. So anyway, our hour is now passed, and I want to thank everybody. And hopefully I'll see you again.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank
Bye,
you.
everyone. Thank you.
Bye.